Good morning, everyone. My name is Aida. I'm a senior, majoring in economics and minoring in Middle Eastern studies. Today, I'll be introducing Professor Joyce. Professor Joyce was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, before it was trendy. He then went to Georgetown University School of Foreign Service for his undergraduate studies, where he decided that international economics was a very important thing to know. As an econ major, I couldn't agree more. He later went to Boston University for his graduate studies and PhD degree. And 37 years ago, he came to Wellesley College for a part-time teaching job and decided this is where he wanted to stay. He teaches classes in macroeconomics, including international macro and globalization, which is, by the way, one of my favorite classes at Wellesley. In 2014, he won the Pinansky Teaching Prize, and his research deals with international capital flow. So are capital flows consistent with financial stability? Why are financial markets so volatile? And what are the causes of the financial crisis? As some of you know, Professor Joyce was the first faculty director of the Madeleine Albright Institute, and he says it was one of the most rewarding experiences of his life. Fun fact, he will celebrate his 28th wedding anniversary next weekend, and he has 2 daughters, neither of whom took a class in economics in college, but he loves them anyway. So before joining me in welcoming Professor Joyce, I would just like to make sure you're all familiar with his style of lecturing or teaching, because cold calling is his favorite. So for those of you who've never had him, this is what happens in class. You're quietly sitting, listening, taking notes, and then suddenly he asks you, "So Aida, what do you think about what just happened?" And then you have to come up with an answer. So just be prepared, because that might happen to you this morning. So, Professor Joyce, welcome back to the Albright Institute.
Great. Thank you, Ida. It is a great pleasure to be here today for many reasons. But it is indeed, as I'm sure you know, the 10th year of the Institute. And I'm just very pleased to see that the Institute continues to thrive and prosper. And certainly, I hope you realize that that's due to the very hard work of Takis and Rebecca and the folks who work with them. So one task you have over the next 2 weeks is to make sure you communicate that to them, your appreciation for what they do. Because having done the job, it's a lot of work. So I particularly know what they do. But they've done extraordinarily well. And so I'm just so pleased to see how the institutes continue to grow and evolve, and to realize every year there are 40 women who are impacted by it. Okay, so my job is to talk about globalization, and globalization is one of those topics which seems to be very divisive, and people have strong opinions about it. In the last presidential election, we had, on the one hand, the man who became president, President Trump, and on the other hand, Senator Sanders for the Democratic nomination, and they certainly had different views about the world. And yet, in some ways, they both were unhappy with globalization. Now, there were different aspects of globalization they were unhappy about. As you well know, the president is very unhappy about migration, but he's pretty mixed about international trade, too. He's made that pretty clear. And Senator Sanders certainly was also rather suspicious in some ways of international trade and transactions. So even though they came from very different ends of the spectrum, clearly globalization was seen as a hot topic issue. And of course, it's not just the US. On the right is Marine Le Pen, who you may know is a French leader of a national party, who very much was suspicious of the euro and European integration. She lost the last election, but it'll be curious to see if she comes back for the next one. I wonder if anybody recognizes the gentleman on the left. So that is Mr. Matteo Salvini, who was Deputy Prime Minister of Italy. And he has been equally very vocal in terms of being unhappy with globalization. And of course, it's not just on continental Europe. In the next year, we're going to have this incredible event of Britain leaving the EU. Okay? So it is divisive. And the question is, what do we make of this? And so I like giving this talk on the first week because you'll hear a lot of talk about globalization. But my job is to basically to get you ready to think about it. So we'll do a little bit of a definition of globalization, some history, which is fun to talk about, a little bit of economics, which I will convince you is fun to talk about. And then you have a little job to do, a little policy assignment. And I'm going to throw in a little bit of philosophy before we do that. Okay? And then at the end, kind of talk about what's going to be happening in the future and just speculate a little bit about that. Okay? So that's what I'd like to do. The cold calling really is innocuous, okay? I promise you we don't have some big book which put down X's if people don't give the right answer. It simply is a way to get you to participate. And luckily, I know some of you already, so I know some of you are very relaxed about it. So Mariana, you know you're going to be one of the first people called upon, but that's fine with you, I know. So I promise I'll branch away to some of the other folks I see in the room as well. Okay? So if that's okay with you, let's get started. Okay? So definition. What is globalization? Now, I certainly do have a definition, but I realize people in other disciplines might have a different discipline. So Annabelle, can I ask you, when you think of globalization, what does that mean?
I guess I have a computer science background, so I would think essentially of trade. I think particularly of trade and programs that you might build that would affect other people. Particularly thinking about international relationships. So if you build something in the US, like social media, how does that affect people in other countries that are also using it?
So certainly it's true when we think about computer networks, and we'll be talking about this in about 15 minutes, that we think of it very much not on a national basis, but international. And certainly the inter-network nature of the world we live in has certainly pushed globalization ahead. Yeah. Jessica, what else do you think of when you think about globalization?
Well, so I'm coming from a biology background, but when I think of globalization, I think of you're connected, instead of being connected only to the people within your community, you're connected to people across the world through, for instance, the internet and other aspects of computer science, but then also the products that you consume, the media that you watch, etc. It's kind of like the world shrinking in a way.
Yeah. No, that's a very nice way of thinking about it. So let me give you one more interpretation of what globalization is. Okay? It's simply, to an economist, when we think about it, is the linkage of what are domestic markets in terms of goods and services, the things that you and I consume, but also the markets in assets, financial assets, the things that we save, for example, as well as the markets for labor, okay, for people who want to work. Okay? So we open up our boundaries in those markets, and as a result, we have international trade in goods and services, we have international financial flows, and we have the migration of labor. So that's the lens that an economist would bring if we were talking about globalization. That's kind of where we start. Okay? So that's the first thing I want you to think about. But the second thing I hope to show to you in the next 10 minutes is that globalization is not inevitable. It's not something that will always be going forward. That in fact, as we look at the history, we'll see that there have been times when globalization has gone forward, but there have been times when it's gone back. Okay? And it's very important today in 2019 to kind of respect that fact, because we'll see that where we are today is a little bit open to question in terms of where are we going forward or going back. Okay? So let's do the history part, and we'll start off with a pop quiz. So raise your hand if you took AP US History. So this question is for one of you. What am I looking at?
Building railroads in the United States.
Very good. So we are building railroads in the United States. Can we be just a little more precise? Yeah, absolutely correct. It's the United States and its railroads. And what about the railroads?
It's the driving in of the Golden Spike, I think.
Indeed. And what is the Golden Spike?
It's where the two railroads, the Union Railroad met up with the other railroad that was being built from California somewhere in Arizona or Colorado or somewhere.
Close. So it was the meeting of the mighty Union Pacific, which had come west from, I believe, Nebraska, perhaps, as with the Central Pacific, which indeed had come, was heading east from San Francisco. They met in Utah, I think it's 1866, 1869, and they hammered the Golden Spike, and we have the union of the two great railroads, a transcontinental railroad. Thank you. Okay? And that process of having railroad tracks laid and unifying countries is certainly not just taking place in the US at the period. It's taking place in other countries in Europe, in South America, and it means for the first time that travel becomes much easier, much more regular, and so people can count on being able to go to a different part of the country. They know exactly when the train will arrive. That means people can move more quickly, and it means that goods can be shipped more quickly. And so a farmer in the Midwest for the United States, now knows that she can ship her products to Chicago, New York, the West Coast, whatever. And she knows exactly how that will happen. So that's something that's going on at this period of the 1860s and 1870s, that countries now are laying railroad track, which allows travel to become more easy. And it's not just on land. We have steamships. And so that steamship, if you look carefully, you'll see, has both a funnel for the steam and has masts for the sail. So they're not quite sure what they want to be. At some point, as you well know, the masts for the sails will disappear and they just become steamships. But now steam power is sending ships, iron ships, across oceans. And now you can not only send your products across your country, they can go to a port where they can go on a ship and go to a different continent, as can people. So now the whole notion of traveling becomes much more simple, more regular. We can count on being able to go to a different country at a particular point in time. So clearly that's going to encourage migration of people as well as the shipment of goods and services. So things are going on with technology of travel. And it's not just technology of travel. There's another technology that's going on. So one last pop question. What are these guys doing? So it's a bunch of workers standing on a beach, it looks like, and they're dragging something. And what are they dragging? Anybody want to take a guess?
Is it like lines for telegraph?
Exactly. It is the Atlantic cable. Very good. And so now you can actually communicate so much more quickly with people literally around the world. And so initially it's the telegraph. You and I know soon will be the telephone. So that's going on at the same time. So we have all these things happening around the middle of the 19th century, and they really begin to come to fruition in the 1870s. So we begin the first era of globalization in the 1870s, and it is due very much to changes in transportation, changes in the technology of communication, and the ability of people and goods to travel more easily and to communicate more easily. As a result, we have a growth in economic activity. Exports as a proportion of national output, GDP is the national output of a country, begins to rise from less than 5% to almost 8% by 1914. Foreign assets, the amount of foreign savings that you have, okay, also skyrockets from 7% to almost 20% in 1914. A lot of this, by the way, is British money, because that's the empire of the time, and it's British money going to the emerging markets. But in the 1870s and 80s, what are the emerging markets? Well, it's the US, it's Australia, it's Argentina. So that's how that process is taking out. And of course, we have migration, and we have people traveling. And so just for one point of reference, 22 million people leave Europe during the period of 1870s to 1914 to come to the US, but also Australia, Canada, places like that. And of course, Asian people are moving as well. So there's this explosion of activity in terms of goods and services being shipped, people sending their savings around the world, people themselves looking for new jobs and new places. Okay? World GDP, world income rises from $870 at the beginning to $1,500 in 1913. Now be careful, that's an average figure. I'm not saying that everybody benefited. Okay, let's be very clear about that. And we're going to come back to that theme a lot. Okay? But for the big picture, that's what you want to look at. Okay? And by 1913, it really looked like we were in a new era of peace and prosperity. And many people thought things would just continue that way, that because of the interconnection now across continents, that there's no way that anything would happen that would stop that. But of course, you and I know that wasn't quite true. And so in 1914 begins what we call World War I, and all of a sudden things are stopped. And so governments are stopping activity at their borders, that they stopped international trade, particularly for the enemy country. So we had blockades of Germany, for example. We stopped money being sent outside the country, and we certainly slowed down migration. So all this comes to a great dramatic stop in 1914 to 1918. World War ends. There's attempts to, in a sense, go back to the previous period to reestablish globalization. They don't seem to work too well. And then in the 1930s, of course, we have an economic contraction. And so literally the world economy begins to fall apart and to shrink. Okay? Governments now explicitly place restrictions on trade and financial flows because they're trying to what? Insulate their own economy from what's going on around the world. Okay? So that's what they do, with not great success in some cases, okay, because it is a worldwide economic contraction. And of course, as a response, a political response. In the US, we see the rise, of course, to the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt. Okay? But in other countries, we see other people, such as Hitler in Germany and Mussolini in Italy. Okay? So clearly, there's a lot of things going on. and they terminate in another world war, 1939 to 1945. So this clearly shows us globalization is not inevitable. It can be stopped, it can go backwards, and the consequences can be pretty dramatic. Okay? So people knew that during World War II. They looked back in the 1930s and realized that that had not been a very successful response to the economic chaos. And so we're going to come to the next era of globalization that begins around 1945. Okay? And this is a bit different in the sense that now it's not so much technology driving globalization as a decision by policymakers to literally try to reestablish the global economy. And so in 1944, there's a very important conference in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, of the US and the other allied nations at that time. And they agree that they're going to fix the value of their currencies vis-a-vis each other. They're going to limit capital flows. They're going to do the sort of things to help stabilize their economy. Okay? So this is a different type of globalization. It's more conscious. It's more a policy move. Okay? And this begins what I call the second era of globalization. And indeed, we have the Bretton Woods Conference and other meetings. Okay? And what they're doing now is bringing down the walls that have been erected between 1914 and 1945. So trade becomes more common. And so we have world exports rising again. And this, again, is called a global age of growth. But again, the growth is mostly in Western Europe, US, Canada, and Japan. So it's not a fully worldwide phenomenon. But again, there is an increase in world GDP per capita that goes on during this period. Okay? So this is the Bretton Woods era that some people look backward to and say it was probably one of the best eras we've had. Okay? But you'll notice the date. So in 1973, a lot of things happen. Okay? We have the breakdown of the Bretton Woods Agreement, and now exchange rates become more volatile. Capital flows start up again, and we'll talk about that. Okay? We have a quadrupling of oil prices in 1973, which was a major shock to the world economy. And different economies that were importers responded differently. The more advanced economies tried to figure out a way to get around this, and they did. Okay? The developing countries, many of them, tried to borrow money to finance their oil imports. And they borrowed money from international banks that in turn had to get in the deposits of the oil exporters. And that's called recycling. So think about an oil importing country such as in Brazil, paying money to a Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia banks the money in Switzerland, the UK, okay? And then one of those banks lends it back to Brazil, which in turn sends it back. That's recycling, okay? And it seemed like a good idea at the time during the 1970s, but of course it means these developing countries are simply building up debt. And in the 1980s, we realized that that debt was unsustainable. And so we have a debt crisis, particularly for Latin American countries. The debt crisis really hit Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, Venezuela, countries like that, really severely. And it's called a lost decade, particularly for developing countries. But other things are going on. The Soviet Union, of course, is breaking up, and we have the emergence or re-emergence of Eastern Europe. We have China all of a sudden taking a radically new route in terms of the world economy. So there's a lot of things going on. And so we have what I call the third era of globalization, beginning around 1990. And this is somewhat like the first era, and that is driven by technology. So we've had ships before, but not ships like that. That's a container ship. And that totally changed the economics of international trade, because now you could load a ship with these containers. It gets easy to take them on and off, and it makes trade a lot cheaper in terms of literally sending goods across the oceans. Okay? And it's not just travel. Okay? It again is communication. And now indeed we do have the internet, which allows network computers in one country to interact with other computers in another country to allow us access to the World Wide Web that has all sorts of important information on it. So again, those things are not planned, but they happen. And we come to this era in which all of a sudden there's a different group of players. The new emerging markets now are going to be the Brazils, Russias, Chinas, Indias. And those are the ones that are driving growth. And so we see incredible growth rates in China of over 10% a year, 8% in India. And now world per capita GDP is rising. And now it's more of an even rise. It's not just Europe and the US. Okay? But there's some not so good things happening. We have capital flows, money crossing boundaries, and we have financial crises in Mexico, East Asia, Russia, Brazil, Argentina. So that clearly is a problem. And we begin to see an increase in income inequality within places in Europe and the US. So that's something, part of globalization, that all of a sudden is starting to attract attention. Okay? And of course, it ends in the global financial crisis of 2008-09. Okay? So that was 10 years ago. Where are we today? Not sure. Have we started a fourth era of globalization? That by way of the leaders of the G20, the group of 20 countries representing the major economies. And they were very happy in 2010 because we had survived the global crisis. And so President Obama is up there and other leaders all waving at us. And they feel they've gotten, out of the terrible conditions of the global financial crisis. But are we in a new era of globalization, or is it a new transition? Is it like the 1980s? What's going on right now? Okay, so we'll start off by raising that as our question. So before we start doing the economics, let me just see if there are any questions about the history of the era, or some of the things that we just heard about. I'm just trying to give you a sense of the big picture, what was going on. And as I said, nothing's inevitable. Things can move backwards, they can stagnate. And that's important to think about as we start beginning our discussions. Okay? Any questions? Okay. So now comes the economics part. Don't look pained, okay? It'll be fine, okay? And I may call upon some of the economic majors to help me out a little bit here. So let's talk about, in particular, some of the types of economic flows that happen. And of course, trade is one of them. So this is a graph that begins, I believe, in 1960, goes up to 1915. And you can see that every year, trade is going up as measured by exports as a percent of GDP. You see a big dip. That, of course, is 2008-09, when the world economy contracts. Then it comes back up, but notice it stopped rising. Been a little stagnant in the last couple of years, okay? So what do we know about trade, okay? Well, international trade allows countries to engage in what we call comparative advantage, which means what do you make best for your country, okay? And then you can sell that to the rest of the world. Two examples. The US sells aircraft. Why? Because aircraft making modern jets takes a lot of capital equipment, takes a lot of skilled labor, okay? And so we have firms like McDonnell Douglas and Boeing in this country, and that's what they're good at. They can make aircrafts, and they sell them to the rest of the world. Textiles are very, very different. You don't need as much equipment. You do need labor, so labor costs become more important. And Bangladesh has a lot of labor. And so in Bangladesh, a lot of textiles and clothing are made and then shipped to the rest of the world. So that's a very simple explanation of why countries trade. They get to engage in their comparative advantage. Okay? The amount of trade differs across countries. You have exports and imports. If you have more exports than imports, you have a surplus. More imports and exports, you have a deficit. The US has a trade deficit. China has a trade surplus. Is that a bad thing? The President of the United States seems to be completely fixed by it. An economist will be a little more relaxed in terms of how to interpret whether or not a country has a deficit or a surplus or not. Okay? But I don't want to talk about that. I want to think simply about trade in general and raise the question, is it good to have international trade? So we have some pros, some positive things I'm going to show you, and some negative things, okay? But before I show you my list, let me get ready with the microphones to ask these guys something, okay? So Natalia, I'm going to make you go first, only because I know you're going to give a good answer. What might be some of the reasons why we think trade is good in general? Not all the time, not for everyone, but in general, what might be some of the benefits of having a country exchanging goods with the rest of the world? And again, there's no one right answer, okay? There's a lot of things we could talk about. So Natalia, what would you think about?
I would go back to the comparative advantage you just spoke about. There are quality advantages or technological advantages that when a certain region is a leader in, say, in an area that I'm familiar with, construction materials, and really has some even bigger goals in mind, like sustainability, efficiency, energy, climate protection, then it is beneficial to bring these products to the areas that have not developed the technology, or it would cost much more to have the technology in that area. And I think there's a win-win on both sides.
Very good. I knew Natalia knew international trade personally, so I knew she was going to give a very articulate answer. Okay. Who else? Can I ask your name, please, at the end?
Envy.
Okay. And by the way, you really should wear your name tags. That's what
Yeah.
what she was telling you that for. Go ahead.
My name's Envy. I'm an English major. I guess like an increase in consumership.
Okay. And in particular, that when you go to Target or Walmart and you see things there that are usually relatively cheap, it's because they come from abroad. So yeah, it makes the ability to buy things more easy, okay? We can buy things more cheaply than they were built here. So definitely there are some pros, and you guys did a fabulous job because you'll see, you said exactly what I was going to say, that comparative advantage indeed allows countries to specialize in the things they should, and allows imports for countries where they can be made more cheaply than they're made in the US. So that's great, okay? But there's also kind of a downside, okay? There can be a number of downsides. So Sabrina, what might be an aspect of international trade that's not so great?
So an aspect that might not be as good, in one of my classes we talked about how it doesn't always encourage like certain investments in developing countries, and how rather than developing the infrastructure to expand into more profitable markets, a lot of times like they continue to, like there's capital flight and they continue to work in areas that aren't always beneficial to their populations.
So we're certainly going to talk about international finance and things like capital flight in a couple of minutes. What else about trade, though, for the country where, you know, we're having the imports taking place? So would you like to ask, so I could ask your name, please?
Halle. My name's Halle. Yeah, I think one of the things with, one of the downsides of international trade is that when countries take in like cheap products, say for example, like, you know, the US exports secondhand clothes to, you know, some places, some countries in Africa. So when they import those, then it kind of kills the textile industry in the country, because then they're getting in cheap clothes, and then the local products cannot compete with the cheap imports.
Absolutely correct. Very good. Very well said. It is a huge problem for African nations that should have, like Bangladesh, a thriving textile industry, but instead are being bombarded by cheap clothing from the US, and that obviously makes it harder for local people to start up if they have that type of competition. So that's good, very good. What else? Alexandra?
Yeah, so two things that I thought of would be labor sometimes can be more exploited, and because there can almost sometimes be like, I'm in environmental studies and we talk about a race to the bottom effect occasionally, and with environmental things and labor, it can be that you produce things in regions where they don't have as strong of labor or environmental protections, which can result in the importing country not feeling the impact of this like dirty industry, but the exporting country bearing all of that.
Okay. So certainly countries that export resources, okay, we certainly see environmental after effects as a result. And so, for example, I've been reading about Southeast Asia, where they cut down a lot of the timber, which of course is profitable for the country then to sell around the world, but it means you've taken away the natural coverage of large parts of the land, and has all sorts of impacts upon the local environment. So clearly there can be negative effects of having more trade. Yeah. Let me ask for one more on this side. So is that Hollis? Is that right?
Yeah, I think also when there's especially like a shift in comparative advantage too, so when it, for example, becomes cheaper for US companies to manufacture certain goods in other countries, that also leads to things like the economic depression in the Rust Belt and like Appalachian mining, things like that.
Very good. So Hollis, you exactly hit the button that I'm going to show next, that we talk about correctly countries reallocating resources, where now Natalia began. But you know what? Resources are not simply something you just move around like clay or sand or something like that, okay? It can be difficult to switch people, laborers, to a new sector. So telling a 50-year person, we're not going to export or make any more what you make because we're going to import it from somewhere else, go get a job as a hedge fund manager. No, that's not going to happen. That's not the way it works, okay? And we know that import competition has led to less manufacturing jobs in the US, and economists are trying very hard to measure the size of the impact. Having said that, I have to immediately add, there's a lot more going on besides trade that affects manufacturing. That the whole notion of manufacturing jobs have changed enormously within my lifetime. And now as a result, factories rather are much more automated than they ever were. So literally a lot of those jobs are gone. They just don't exist anymore. It isn't that we've taken factories and somehow reassembled them in Mexico. Those factories are totally redesigned. So you're right, absolutely, that there is an impact on labor as a result of trade, and we know that and we try to measure it, but I don't want you to think it's only because of international trade. There's a lot of other things going on at the same time. Very good. So bottom line, trade has benefits. People benefit in a number of ways, and these two guys gave us exactly the things I was thinking about. But there's other effects. There's effects on labor as we reallocate. There's effects on the environment. That certainly is true. And so we got to take that into consideration. Okay? Finance, my specialty. So there's a little chart that shows international capital as a percent of GDP, and it also rises from 1990 to about 2008 when it falls sharply. Comes back, but again, you'll notice it's come back, but not to where it was before. Okay? So finance allows investors to allocate their money around the world, okay, and borrowers to access that money, which may be more cheaply than it was in the domestic country. It includes what we call foreign direct investment in factories and firms, real assets, but also what's called portfolio. So if you own stocks or bonds, that's called portfolio, as well as bank loans. Countries can be a net creditor, such as China, or a net debtor, such as the US. Okay? So that's what finance is all about. That's what's going on in finance. Okay? And again, I ask you what might be some of the pros, and then we'll ask what some of the cons. Okay? So let's see. Right, I'll ask you to help us. Okay? What might be a good thing about international finance? So the question is, why might this be beneficial?
Let's say if a government doesn't have enough funds to invest into its economy, then FDI are always can stimulate an area that lacks its funds.
Okay, so it allows governments and countries to obtain funds that might not be available domestically, which presumably can help the country grow more quickly over time. Good. What else might be a positive? Anybody on this side? What might be a positive thing that results due to international financial flows? Hi, could you tell me your name, please?
Tharshi.
Tharshi, could you think of anything positive about all this, besides the one that Ida just gave us?
In addition to FDI, it, I guess the presence of larger financial companies in developing countries creates access to more jobs in a sector that wouldn't have otherwise been really made available.
Very good. So a financial sector domestically might be strengthened in a sense if you have foreign investment come in to help big up the banking sector and things like that. And that absolutely is something that economists look at, how financial FDI, investing in new banks and things like that might affect. Okay? There's one other aspect I'll mention, which is that those who own the stocks and bonds can benefit by diversification, which means you don't keep all your money in one country. You try to spread it around. So there's a downturn in one country, hopefully another country, opposite is happening. Okay? So there certainly are some positives in terms of diversification, getting money at cheaper rates. Okay? But again, we can say, yeah, okay, what might be some of the downsides? Okay? So Yashin, I'm going to ask you maybe for a downside. Yashin's back there. What might be not so great about international finance?
I think even if you're diversifying your assets, you're still dependent on interest rates and inflation in different countries.
Yeah. You're always going to be subject to what's going on in the economy of a particular country. Yeah. What else might be seen as a bad side? So someone in the back row over here. Can I ask your name, please? Yeah. Elizabeth, can you take the microphone? What might be a negative aspect? And again, there's no one right answer. There's a lot of things we could be talking about.
I guess anytime you're borrowing a lot of money, if you can't pay it back, there's problems.
Yeah, I mean, debt can certainly be a burden. And I could spend an hour just going through debt crises. And clearly Greece would be on the list, but you saw my list before of Russia, East Asia, Brazil, countries like that. So yeah, debt can be a problem. Okay? Anybody else? What might be a negative aspect of international finance?
Hi, my name's Alberta. In terms of speculation, when it's impacting local markets, so for example, in Mexico, I think in the early 2000s, there was a tortilla crisis in which speculators in, I think, New York were raising the prices of tortillas just through speculation. And so that made it so that people in Mexico couldn't actually eat what is a staple of their traditional diet. And so then you see things like malnutrition, which we talked about yesterday, that has deleterious effects for generations to come.
So financial flows can certainly destabilize within a country. So we'll take one more comment and then we'll, up here. Hi, what's your name?
Hi, Mahin. So whoever the international investing body is very much dictates what it is invested in, and they would obviously look for industries that are going to give them the maximum returns. And the effects that it has on an economy, on various sectors, is basically the negative effects are felt by the domestic industries. For example, if you look at the Chinese investment in different countries in Africa, it doesn't have great effects for the people there. Or if you look at Greece, the way they were dictated to take austerity measures actually is going to have very severe repercussions for their economy moving forward.
So these crises can affect countries very deeply. So I had down among the cons, it makes the job of a central bank harder. Going back to your story about Mexico, if all this money is coming in and out, and you're the domestic central bank, you're trying to figure out how to handle that stuff. You may be surprised to hear there's actually relatively little evidence of a positive impact on growth of international finance. When we look at the data, we don't see a whole lot of positive things. And financial markets can indeed be very volatile, and they're international, which means the volatility can be carried over to another sector. Okay? So again, yes, there are positive things, no question about it. And investors can benefit and borrowers can benefit, okay? But finance in particular can be very volatile and has all sorts of effects that can be negative for a country. And so that's something we've thought a lot in the last 10 years since the last crisis. Migration. Now this should be an easy one. You don't need to be an economist to figure this one out, okay? Migration, of course, is when people simply cross borders looking for better jobs. Caveat, I'm not talking about refugees. I'm not talking about the Syrians who fled their country because of chaos. That's a different topic, okay? I'm giving more, no, the migrant who looks for a better job. It may be that partly a better job because of the chaos in our country. But again, I'm focusing on those people who travel because they want a better life, a better job, a better opportunity for their families as well. So that's what migration is all about, okay? There are over 258 migrants in the world, of which quite a few are in the United States. Okay? So migration is a big issue in the United States, as you all well know. Okay? And again, third time, and I promise it'll be the last time I'll do this to you. What are some of the pros and what are some of the cons? Okay? So we can start on this side. Someone who hasn't spoken. Hi, can I ask your name?
Charlotte.
Charlotte, yeah. What might be some of the good things of having people legally, let's be clear, come and work in your country?
It can satisfy demand for employment that isn't being satisfied in a certain industry.
Absolutely. So simply unmet jobs, absolutely, no question about it, okay? What else? What else might be a positive aspect of migration?
A lot of the people that migrate from different countries come with highly specialized skill sets, and they can contribute those skill sets in the various jobs that they take up.
Very good, okay? So the pros include increasing the size of the economy, which is an implication of what you guys said, and they come with scarce skills, particularly, I know, in the tech sector. Okay? So it's hard to imagine Silicon Valley if it didn't allow migrants to come to the United States. Okay? And they pay taxes. They pay taxes that in turn allow the US, for example, to pay for the Social Security program. Okay? So why, I ask you, and you don't need to be an economist, why are people against migration? Is there a logical reason as opposed to the pure fear and xenophobia that you get sometimes people talking about? Can a case be made? So can we ask this person back there? Is it Maggie?
Maggie. My background is in computer science. Actually, I wasn't thinking of probably something you were thinking of. I was thinking of the opposite. So for the country that the migrant is leaving, there could be something of a brain drain. So with all of the migrants are leaving from that country, all their specialized skills are leaving that country if that happens in much of an exodus.
So this is a great topic for people who specialize in this field to talk to you about, okay? Because it's true, those people can leave, but here's the thing, which makes it a little more complicated. Many times they send money back home to their families, and that's a positive thing. And what we're seeing, particularly in places like India, is that 20, 30 years down the line, they come home. And if they do come home, they bring their skill set back home, and they try to start it up at home. So you're right, literally, when you lose people who are highly educated, that's a loss to a country, particularly, by the way, if they're medical people, okay? But over time, we see these interesting dynamics, if you follow the same people in the same country in terms of what goes on down the line. So there's kind of a mixed bag as a result of that, absolutely, yeah. Anybody else want to tell me, what do you think people who are against migration when they try to come up with a logical reason, not simply a fear factor? So we'll ask Jessica maybe, can you give me a logical case, as to why you might be worried about this?
It could be a strain on infrastructure if you have a high influx of people. Specifically, my home state is Washington State, and we have a high influx of migrant workers who work on the farms. And another pro is that they fill jobs that American workers are not willing to take.
Very good. So I said migrants pay taxes, and it's true, okay? But on the one hand, they might depress the wages of some of the native-born wage workers. By the way, if there's any evidence of that, it's for people without a high school education. They certainly will have more competition for older migrants who came here 10 years ago. So that's the group that's really impacted. But Jessica, the last thing is it raises expenditures on local. So it's not a lot of help for the state of Washington to know that the federal government is getting money for Social Security if they have to pay for more roads, more schooling, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a real mismatch between the expenditures on a local level and the taxes on the federal level. Okay? So again, yes, there are positives, no question about it, but there are some downsides as well. Okay? So clearly what we're seeing is that there's a bit of a complicated picture when we ask whether or not international economic flows in terms of people, trade and money, whether or not they benefit a place or not. So what's the bottom line? Whether or not, do we benefit when there is more globalization in the way that we talked about it this morning? Well, there's an answer that I can give you. And Rebecca, I'm going to ask you to help me out. I'm going to actually stop talking, you'll be happy to know, for a few minutes, because I found a great clip that explains what's called the elephant graph that you're looking at. So I'm going to stop. We're going to watch this clip for a couple of minutes.
But first, a key part of President Trump's campaign was pledging to restore prosperity and to ease the anxiety for those left behind by globalization. Income inequality was a problem during President Obama's tenure, too. The trend began well before either man took office, and the widening gap here is connected to growth in other parts of the world. Our economics correspondent Paul Salman has been exploring those trends, and it's the focus of his weekly segment, Making Sense.
The good news is that people that are around this point A, like 1/3 of the global population, have done really quite well.
At the City University of New York Graduate Center, economist Branko Milanovic. And the hottest curve in economics right now, charting the climb of 1 billion out of poverty and explaining the rise of China, the rise of populism in Europe, the rise of Donald Trump. And thanks to its pachydermal profile and Twitter, it has an almost unforgettable name, the elephant chart.
I remember in June 2012, the first time that I saw what later became the elephant chart, I was immediately struck because I thought, well, that's exactly what we all knew.
And what is it that we knew?
Well, we knew that China and large groups of people in Asia who are not very rich compared to the Americans have done very well. We knew that the lower and middle class Americans and Japanese and Germans have not done well. And then we also knew that the top 1% in the rich countries have done well.
Now, at the risk of Dumboing this down, let's take the elephant chart from tail to tusk. For that, we have to head into the wild blue yonder of my producer's basement. On the bottom, the horizontal axis is the entire world population, arranged by their incomes back in 1988. Poorest over here on the left, the richest to the right. Just past the middle, at about the 55th percentile, a family of 4 with $3,000 a year after-tax income. A middle-class U.S. family taking home $30,000 a year would land about here, at the 80th percentile. And in 1988, $160,000 of after-tax income would have lifted you into the global 1%. On the vertical axis, going from bottom to top, is how much income grew in percentage terms over 20 years, from 1988 to 2008. The two winning groups, the fabled 1%, and those in the middle of the income distribution. As for the poorest, they had about a 10% rise.
If they started with like $2 a day, now they have $2.3 a day.
But now, what this story is telling us is here, at the middle of the income distribution globally,
right.
Those people have almost doubled their income in real terms after taxes.
After taxes, yeah. And as you can see, this is not a small group of people. So we are talking about people from the 40th percentile to the 70th. So this is almost like 1/3 of the global population who have done really quite well.
And who are we talking about here? These are the Indians in Bangalore, the Brazilian middle class, the South Koreans, the Chinese who flocked from the countryside to the cities.
There was a large chunk of people, 2.5 billion, who have done extremely well.
And those are the people up at the top of the back of the elephant.
Top of the back of the elephant. So basically what is called the resurgent Asia.
Resurgent Asia indeed. Now, you may have seen one of the most popular TED Talks of all time.
Income per person on this axis instead. Poor down here, rich up there.
The late, great Hans Rosling depicting this phenomenon in his own inimitably graphic way.
You see, China under foreign domination actually lowered their income and came down to the Indian level here, whereas UK and United States is getting richer and richer, and after the Second World War, United States is richer than UK. But independence is coming here, growth is starting, economic reform, growth is faster.
So the good news is that income inequality has, from a global perspective, gone down, as the incomes in the developing world rise, catching up with incomes in the developed world. And that's a point the elephant chart is often used to make. But perhaps the chart's most memorable message of the moment is the crisis of inequality in the very well-developed world, the hollowing out of the middle class in France, the United Kingdom, and especially the United States of America. Here, at incomes of about $20,000 to $100,000 a year, inflation adjusted, there's been negligible income growth for decades. Once you get to the 70th percentile, so you're the richest 30% of the world's income distribution, falls off a cliff.
True. These were really people who are generally dissatisfied with their economic position and who feel threatened by migration and who feel threatened by lack of jobs or insecurity of jobs. And you look at actually who are voting for Le Pen in France, who voted for Brexit and Trump, we saw that this sort of a growth of right-wing populism is driven on the one hand by this insecurity of jobs, which is a result of globalization, and by migration, which is also part and parcel of globalization.
And globalization was supposed to be win-win for everyone, wasn't it?
One thing was promised to them essentially with globalization, they will all get better off, and then gradually they see that their wages are stagnant, and they've been stagnant for 25 years.
The rich get richer, the trunk of the elephant tilted skyward, and then of course you look backwards, and then you see that these people might be catching up to you.
Right. Because they actually are coming on a big tide, like a wave, then really your relative position is going to really slide down quite quickly.
And so we end with the jumbo takeaway, that while a rising middle class in the developing world has been narrowing global inequality for decades, the story's been just the opposite closer to home, and fueling a reaction as radical as it is understandable. For the PBS NewsHour, this is economics correspondent Paul Salman, reporting from the City University of New York and my producer's basement.
And we're just glad you're safe, Paul. And there's more of Paul's conversation with economist Branko Milanovic on our website. You can find it at pbs.org/newshour.
If you're interested in this particular topic, Mr. Milanovic has a fabulous book out in the last couple of years about inequality. And as you can probably guess, he's a very good writer, a very good economist, and it's just great to kind of follow his analysis of everything. Okay, so that's what you're looking at, the evidence. And the evidence is, it depends on who we're talking about. Yes, some people have benefited from globalization, others not so much, and we can really identify who's who. And we can talk about the rising incomes in China and India and Indonesia, the booming global elite in London and Manhattan and places like that. But then we have the decline of the middle class in Western Europe, the US, and certainly the poorest nations have not benefited very much from globalization. So it is a mixed bag, okay? So globalization has wide-ranging effects. Those who take advantage of the opportunities can benefit, no question about that, but not everyone gains, and there may be more inequality within countries, okay? So the question is, how can we get some of the benefits of globalization while minimizing the negative side effects, okay? Would you like me to answer that question? I'm not going to. You are, okay? And before I give you your assignment, let me just mention one way of thinking about this whole issue. This is a bit of philosophy, in particular ethics. And the question is, who should you be concerned about when you think about obligations? A commutarian says, think about your community, people with whom you identify, okay? Which is usually seen as a national phenomenon. Your responsibilities are to that community, okay? So if you're U.S. policymaker, it's the U.S. that you represent. It's interesting to talk about India, but that's not your concern. A cosmopolitan says no. Those are artificial divisions, okay? You really should be concerned about the impact of policies around the world. And so clearly you can see there's going to be a real divergence in terms of how the two groups look at policies and how to interpret policies and what should be done over time, okay? So now comes your work, okay? I know you've already been organized in groups, so this should be fairly straightforward. And I've given assignments to each group. Group number one, this row right here, congratulations. You represent business firms. So business firms include some that export, but others that import. So you're going to spend 10 minutes trying to figure out how do we feel about all this globalization. Okay? Group two, you're the unions. You represent your workers in the union. So there may be workers in the country who don't work for the union yet. How do we feel about that? How do we think about all this stuff about trade and everything? Okay? So that's your responsibility. Group number three, you represent the government, the governments. Okay? And by the way, this is not a U.S. phenomenon I'm talking about. So in your mind, you can choose any country. This is not at all about the U.S. And what do government policymakers about this globalization? How does it make their job harder? How might they respond? What sort of policies would they care about? Okay? Group four, now this gets interesting. You guys are strongly motivated by concerns about the environment. That to you is a big deal. And so the question is, how do you feel about all this globalization activity? Okay? Group five, where are they? Great, back here. Now you guys have a very special job. You represent everybody roughly your age. See, these guys over here already have agendas, right? They already are concerned about the environment, the government, what have you. You guys are starting off, and your perspective is long term. So you're not trying to protect anything so much as thinking about what over time would be best as you guys mature and grow professionally. So good luck with that one, okay? And now I need three more, so I did have three more. So group six, okay? You represent the technology sector. Remember we talked about the internet and everything? So imagine you work in that sector, and you clearly believe in that sector, and you want to move forward over time, and you know about globalization, and you know about government policies. So the question is, what sort of policies might you be in favor versus what might you oppose? What do you think about government regulation? Something I assure you that people in Silicon Valley are thinking a lot about these days. Okay? Let's see, that was 6. 7, let me think about my next group, healthcare. You guys represent people within your country who work in hospitals and the medical field and things like that. Okay? And the question is, all right, here you are. We have a world in which people are traveling across borders. People can carry illnesses. How do we think about that? Number 2, there are people in other countries who need medical help. Think Ophelia Dahl, okay? And come up with some ideas about how people in that sector might view globalization and what are the challenges for them, okay? And the last group, let me try to dig into my memory. Bear with me, I do have a task for you, okay? I'm not going to forget you. Who's left? Oh, I know who's left. The financial sector. You're Wall Street. You represent financial flows, okay? And there are benefits of financial flows, we heard that. And so the question is, what would be the best type of financial flows? I'm going to give you a hint. There's a big difference between someone who has a portfolio of stocks and bonds in another country, which can be very in and out, versus a firm that puts up a factory that might, for example, train people, okay? So think about that distinction between the different types of foreign investment, okay? So what I'd like you to do is spend 5-10 minutes at most talking about this, and then I'll ask each group to say something, and then we'll finish up, okay? Is it easy for you to just rearrange the chairs? I've heard you've done that already. I realized I could have given you half an hour of the discussions and it would not have been enough time. So you begin to understand these issues. It takes a while to thresh them out. And it may be there'll be some discussions tonight in the dorm between you, continuing what you talked about today, and that would be fabulous, okay? I'm simply going to ask somebody from each group to say a word or two about what your discussion was about, okay? So I actually was going to go in reverse order and ask the finance folks to start off. So do you mind if we start on this side and kind of work around that way? So I'm sorry, yeah.
Our group was advocating for the financial sector, and I think we came to a consensus that whether or not you're in a developing country, like whatever policies that you make that advocate for financial sector will always allow the financiers to like move their capital around. So like the regulation will allow Wall Street to be able to like take out their capital and diversify in other countries, which we've seen the advantages of what the advantages are. So yeah, the policies that we would make, if they were to be in favor of like the Wall Street or financiers in general, would be for them to allow free capital flows, in fact, limit regulation of the government, and probably try and our government involvement would be to try as much as we can to regulate whatever finance is coming in from the outside, but to push for the governments outside to allow our financiers to take out the capital from our countries, which, as a side note, I think like the IMF does that. We agree that the IMF does that in like creating policies that tell the third world, like, allow finance to come into your countries, do not regulate it, because they know that so few developing countries will bring finance into the developed world, and they know that, government regulation would not affect that kind of finance. Yeah, so that's what we came up with.
To be fair to the IMF, it's evolved a lot. Before 2008, there's no question that they advocated for a free flow of capitals. But they're not stupid people there. They got it. There was a financial crisis, and they realized how bad it was. So they become a lot more open to the use of capital controls, which is the technical name of trying to stop money, and when it can be warranted. And so I give them a certain amount of credit. They were wrong. They admitted it, and now they're willing to kind of change their position. There has been a real change in the attitude on regulation in general. You may like the fact that you can invest your money, but you're not so crazy perhaps if others can, if the result is going to be a financial crisis. So yeah, you like freedom for yourself, but you don't want the other idiots blowing up the system. And so that clearly is kind of a complicated position to take. How about in health? Somebody tell me about something that people who are worried about health might talk about.
So we spent a lot of our time tackling actually the complexity of this issue. So we started off with thinking about comparative advantage. So like, is there a way to train workers from places that have low resources, lack of funding and research opportunities, and bring them over in a program for 8 years? And then Ali pointed out in my idea that a lot of these workers come to the United States because they're fleeing from civil war conflict. And so having this idea of like, okay, we'll train you for 8 years and then send you back is not, plausible. And so we began to think about ideas of how, and kind of working off of what Ophelia Dahl was talking about yesterday, of potentially like working with the foreign governments to put aside funding to pay for care workers, especially in these regions where care workers are not being offered the kinds of things that they need, like education for their children or education for themselves, a stable wage, resources that they come to the United States or other countries to look for.
This is an area where a cosmopolitan point of view to me makes more sense, that there is a reason to worry about people's health in other countries, if only because if they get sick, eventually, obviously, it can spread around the world. So even from a self-interest, you want other people to be healthy. Can I just say that in my involvement with the Institute, that me and Ophelia Dahl was one of the high points. She is such an impressive person, and I've always really enjoyed a chance to talk to her. Technical people, what do you guys want? Besides faster machines, bigger machines, I don't know.
So we concluded that the tech world is for globalization across all aspects of it, because, well, for starters, the brain drain helps the tech world because you have all these people coming to more developed countries where the larger tech companies have headquarters and contributing to those companies. And then in terms of manufacturing, the tech companies have been able to shift the production of a lot of their products to countries which are manufacturing intensive and then decrease the cost of production, which in turn benefits them. And then in terms of government policy, we realize that tech companies are in favor of working with governments in more developing countries to come up with policies that benefit them, but in a very one-sided way, because it also helps increase our user base. But at the same time, government policy that has to do with, say, the trade war negatively affects tech companies, and that's the kind of policy that they're trying to avoid. And do you want to add?
I also want to add that, for example, China
really wants to get ahead with technologies, and it seeks intellectual rights from Western tech firms. But when it comes to China developing its own technologies, it's not very willing to share their findings. So I feel like tech sector would like to have less legal barriers in terms of sharing technologies among each other. And then, for example, in China, the issue is that the government really wants to take control over the internet and make it closed and sovereign, and like have control over the tech companies and firms. And I think that tech sector would actually maybe like to be more independent of the state so that they can actually decide what they want to create and how to develop it.
You're right. I mean, these are all very hot issues right now. The story of Facebook trying to come into India and the pushback is one of the greatest stories. I wish we had more time to talk about it. It was clear there were Indian activists who said to Mr. Zuckerberg, thanks, but no thanks. We don't need Facebook in our country. And it was a really interesting, domestic response to technology saying, we'll do this ourselves. We don't need you coming in and exploiting us in that way. Hey guys, what do you want from your generation? I'm dying to hear.
So we took on more of a cosmopolitan stance, and so we really delved into the issue of like climate change. And so because there will be countries that will not exist in maybe like hundreds of years, or like maybe 100 years, like when we are maybe still alive, we thought of migration, and we wanted to make sure that like people could migrate when needed, and then did anybody want to add anything? Yeah.
Yeah, we were thinking of what affects us all as a generation, since generation includes so many things. And yeah, we started off by talking about brain drain, by talking about creating robust economies that can give jobs to youth. But then we also thought about the fact that we need to address the climate issue right now. That's on our generation to do that now, for our survival, but also for the survival of everyone else. So that's why we thought about strengthening sanctions on countries in terms of also trade, like having more sustainable trade. And that's going to be our focus.
So it's not surprising to me that they have a much longer perspective, because literally they're looking at the decades ahead of them, that allows them to worry about countries disappearing, not in a century, but in decades from now, as waters continue to rise. But we have an environmental group. So what do you guys talk about?
Our group was debating whether to take on the cosmopolitan or communitarian view. And when thinking about environmental issues, we realized that they would probably have global implications anyways. So then thinking about like trade and the way that different countries operate, we realized that it was probably in the best interest to join like a global environmental protection agreement that would shift incentives from like mass producing products to so that firms could have more environmental considerations as well.
Government policymakers, tell me some of what you talked about.
It was hard for us to kind of narrow down, but I believe that the government definitely has a responsibility for its own country, people, and cannot let them down. But the government is also responsible for being a member of an international community. So some of the issues we were talking about was if you want to reallocate deal with income distribution in your own society, there are ways of both like working on the incentivizing growth, but also on some austerity. We were talking about austerity measures. Are there sectors where there is an overspending, or could there be a more frugal approach to how the biggest problem of like the Rust Belt states could be addressed through policy, whether it be taxes or moving to like supporting through policies using renewable resources, being less dependable on oil, thus saving funds.
Can we have to keep going because I need to finish up. Can we ask the unions what they want?
So when we first started talking, we framed it in the sense that unions are very much communitarian, so they're arguing on behalf of the people in their country or in their respective region. And so we thought that it would be most beneficial to unions in that, importing goods, like everything that we import, plays along the same rules that we do in whichever particular country. And so that would lower the comparative advantage, but it would allow for jobs that the union represents to stay in this particular country. And then we spoke about particular types of immigration.
Yeah, so we spoke a little bit about how so as union workers, we're worried about the middle class in America. Often the people who do not have a very high specialization or do not have very high wages. And so we kind of related that back to Trump's current policies. And for example, with India, his new policy was that Indians can only apply for an H-1B if they earn above $65,000 a year. And so policies like this that save the jobs of a lot of the Americans in the middle class, that was one. The second policy that was in recent years was like the EB-5 visa, which says that Chinese and Indians and I think Brazilians can expedite their citizenship to the US if they invest up to, I think, $500,000 that creates 10 jobs. So policies like this that ensure that we're creating more jobs, but also saving the jobs for the middle class.
Business firms, what do you guys want?
So we were cosmopolitans, not because we want money, but we're just good people. So we thought one of the biggest advantages that firms will get is that you have a bigger consumer base if you are allowed to export and import. You get cheaper factors of production, which lowers your costs of production. Then the countries where you're importing to, it'll create jobs there. And finally, we get more investment.
Very good. It's complicated. And each group obviously came with some type of agenda and then saw globalization from that agenda, okay? So I guess the bottom line is that anybody who says to you globalization is either good or bad, you should push back and say, for whom? Who are we talking about? Because you can make the case for either side, but you should make it for that side and realize that there are other sides as well, okay? So we're almost done. What's going to happen next? Short answer, I have no idea. Longer answer, artificial intelligence is going to totally change the parameters of everything we've talked about this morning. Got to accept the fact that clearly national governments have to learn that the emerging markets are obviously still emerging and will continue to emerge, and that's going to have political repercussions. You guys spoke very eloquently about climate change, so I really don't need to point that out. And I'm simply going to end with the question I raised with you earlier. Are we in a new era of globalization, which will be different from the previous ones? Or are we still in some type of transition? We're still, in a sense, getting over the shock of 2008-09, the change in terms of power between different countries, and trying to grope our way towards some type of new system, which hopefully will allow more inclusive globalization than we've seen in the past. I don't know the answer. You're going to have to tell me in about 20 years what the answer is, okay? Because clearly this is something that's going to take place over time. So that's all I really want you to understand. It's a process. It has benefits and costs. It differs for different groups. Inclusive globalization, I think, should be a goal, but it has to be something to be worked for. It doesn't come automatically. And again, be careful of people who give you easy solutions like, oh, I don't know, a wall or a tariff war or something like that. Those things never work out quite the way you think they're going to. Okay? Oh, thanks.